G'day, bird nerds. I'm Grant. I am a bird nerd. This is the Bird Emergency, where I get to talk with amazing researchers, conservationists, and other interesting folk about birds. Rare birds, endangered birds, extinct birds, common birds, urban birds, any kind of birds, because birds are good. Alex Bond, Dr. Alex Bond, is with us today. And Alex, you're an ecologist and a conservation biologist, but I wanted to just ask you about your the title. Where are we? At the National History Museum, senior curator in charge, comma, birds Tring. I'm hoping that Tring is a location and not something I've never heard of that I should be aware of. How are you?
Yeah, g'day, Grant. Yeah, so I'm a principal curator and the curator in charge of birds at the Natural History Museum in the UK, and indeed the bird collection isn't in London at our expansive South Kensington Museum that some folks might be familiar with. We're in a little market village in Hertfordshire called Tring, which is about 80 kilometers north of London.
Now, the only thing that I can profess to know about Hertfordshire is that there is one of the English netball teams is based in Hertfordshire. So I used to follow an Australian who had moved over there to play in Hertfordshire. So where's Hertfordshire in the geography of the British Isle?
In the grand scheme of things. So it's sort of over towards the Oxford side, northwest of London. So southeast England. But yeah, pretty landlocked.
So more Inspector Morse than Midsummer Murders, would you say?
Yeah, not so much with the brooding coastlines.
Okay, so, very cool. Okay. Alex, we're going to talk a lot about seabirds, because that's been where most of your research output in recent years has been, and particularly plastic pollution. And regular listeners of the show may be aware that Alex was working with Jen Lavers and the Adrift Lab crew on the fleshy-footed shearwaters at Lord Howe Island, or on Lord Howe Island. So maybe we'll touch a little bit about that. But Alex has had a couple of articles that came up in the Google Scholar list that I really want to ask him about. So can we start with the interesting story? You told me that this is a very interesting story. So the article, which I think you published only recently, wasn't it? The provenance of the only known egg of the extinct Tristan moorhen. Please tell us about the Tristan moorhen and the only known egg.
And the only known egg. So if you're familiar with the common moorhen, it looks very similar. It's a species that was found only on the island of Tristan da Cunha, which is in the South Atlantic Ocean, about halfway between South Africa and Brazil. It's the most remote inhabited island in the world. It's about 2,800 kilometers from land. It takes you 10 days to get there by boat. There's no airport. That's your only way to get there. And before I worked at the museum, I worked for the RSPB, which is the BirdLife partner in the UK, and managed the science program on Tristan da Cunha and Gough Island, which has a problem with introduced mice. And in the context of Tristan, there are three extinct species from the main island of Tristan. There's the moorhen. There's a small land bird called the Gough finch, which isn't actually a finch. It's actually a tanager, although sometimes it's called a bunting, but we'll leave that for now. And Tristan albatross, which is one of the great albatrosses, used to breed on the island, but doesn't anymore. And so we were looking back at the history of when these animals were around, were reported, were in museums. this is maybe 5 or 6 years ago, to see if we could estimate based on the records when they went extinct. So there's some mathematical models that we can use based on a series of records that give you a probability that species X exists in a given year. And you take the year which it was most likely to go extinct, and that's sort of your best guess, your estimate. And so Tristan Moorhen was really poorly known. It was flightless. It was often confused with the Gough moorhen, which is another flightless moorhen found on Gough Island. And so for a long time, the two were thought to be the same species, but they're not. And the Tristan one went extinct in sort of the mid to late 1800s. And in the process of going back and, looking at all the old records from, early folks that visited the island, there was a guy named Carmichael who was there in 1819. There's Du Petit Thur who was there in 1793. A lot of these sort of like early, mostly ship-based folks, because Tristan was uninhabited until about 1815. Would record, oh, we saw this bird, we saw that bird, we saw this bird. And as the only sort of large flightless ground bird, the island hen or the island cock was often mentioned. And so at the museum here at the NHM, we've got two skins, including one which is the type, the one that was used to describe the species for the very first time in 1861. And we had this egg. And we couldn't include the egg in our analysis because we didn't actually know where it came from, what date it was. And so we just sort of put it to one side for our sort of big analysis. But we were able to dig into it. And it's got two little pieces of paper on it, or with it. It's very hard to tie a label to an egg. Try it home, please. Let me know how you get on. And it had two little pieces of paper which offered contradictory information. And we were able to figure out that it was probably collected between 1851 and 1856, either by or given to a fellow named Reverend Taylor, who was the first missionary to visit the island. And he then gave it as a gift to a woman named Lady Eliza Grey, who is the wife of Sir George Grey, who was the governor of the then Cape Colony. Who then went on to assume other colonial positions in Australia and New Zealand in the late 19th century. And because we were the NHM, we were sort of the repository for a lot of this, natural history given to colonial administrators around the world. And we were able to say, oh, actually, yes, it is, this egg from George Grey or from Lady Eliza Grey, and likely given to her by this fellow named Dr. Taylor. Why, we don't know. But yeah, a very circuitous route for this one tiny egg.
So, what's the detective process to determine that, to be able to be really confident that you have nailed down the provenance, so to speak? Is it mostly reading old ship's journals and maybe letters, if you can find them, and that kind of source material? Is that how you go about it?
Yeah, a lot of the sort of historical specimen in research is basically an exercise in forensics. It's, right, who is likely to have written this letter? When was it likely to have been written? Piecing together dates. So we knew when we received the egg. We didn't know necessarily from whom. So it's a combination of we knew an egg was collected. We knew that Lady Eliza Grey had an interest in natural history. We knew that she was in the Cape Colony, which is now Western Cape in South Africa, in the 1850s. We knew that an egg was said to have been brought back on a ship called the HMS Frolic. Amazing ship names. You don't get that these days. In 1856. So we know that that's how it eventually got to her, and then you can sort of work your way backwards. A lot of it comes from not just ship's journals, but a lot of early natural history was written up in very obscure publications because we didn't know a heck of a lot about the species, or they were written up in the summaries of meetings of often gentlemen's clubs, where people would gather around and eat and drink and smoke and talk about, right, I saw this fantastic, lovely bird, which I then shot and named after so and so. Which happens a lot in the sort of 19th and early 20th century. So yeah, a lot of it is that sort of historic archival work, but also knowing, the NHM collection and figuring out sort of our own internal documents about, right, when did this come in? Who did it come in with? How has it been looked at, cataloged, labeled? Yeah, it can be a lot of fun, but it can also be incredibly time consuming.
So the Tristan moorhen, how closely related was it to other moorhens? Like the moorhen is sort of a global complex, isn't it? I mean, there was a time where both moorhen and coot was sort of thought of as one species. It was cosmopolitan. So how different? It's flightless. Was it bigger than say the UK moorhen or what we have here, the dusky moorhen? Very similar coloration, like the orange and yellow beak, and essentially a black / brown bird.
More or less. They've got compared to, so they're bigger than dusky moorhen. They're about the same size as European moorhen, Gallinula chloropus. They've got a slightly larger facial shield. That sort of red blob on their forehead is a little bit bigger, and their wings their wings are much reduced compared to European moorhen. So they are genuinely flightless. There was no way they could have, and that happens when you have especially rails like these guys on islands. They just figured, oh, what's the point in flying? It takes a lot of energy. Got everything I need here. Nothing's eating me. Just set up home here. But yeah, I mean, for all intents and purposes, it looks a lot like a common moorhen.
And I'm guessing on tell us on Tristan, is it essentially grassland, tussocky grassland habitat, or are there genuine marshes and sort of swampy habitat? Like what would the Tristan moorhen have spent its days doing?
So Tristan is about 96 square kilometers. It's basically a circle, 12 kilometers in diameter, and it's over and a peak at the top, 2,000 meters up. So in sort of the early pre-settlement times, there's one woody tree to the island called island tree, or Phylica, which is only found on Tristan, and a small island in the Indian Ocean.
And let's just clarify that. There's one species of woody tree, not
one single tree.
It's not the Joshua tree.
No. But yeah, there's tussock grasses, and it's a very fern dominated habitat. So yeah, there would have been lots of places for them to poke around.
And were lots of other birds? You mentioned there were only a couple of endemic bird species, but is it a place that lots of like seabirds are visiting, and spending part of the year there?
I mean, the difficulty with Tristan is because it's been inhabited by people for 200 years now, and it's so isolated. Is the island has to by necessity be relatively self-sufficient. So at the moment it has introduced rats and mice. It previously had cats. It's got sheep, goats, and cows that graze. So the seabird fauna is the avifauna in general, the birds in general, are much reduced compared to 200 years ago when it was first settled. So, but there are islands nearby. So there's Nightingale and Inaccessible Island, which are only about 40 kilometers away, which are just seabird havens. Millions of burrowing petrels, prions, shearwaters, albatrosses, that sort of thing. So,
I,
but yeah,
I'm,
the big stuff more or less disappeared. Basically as a food source in the 19th century.
I'm just going to have a wild guess at this one, but I, I'm assuming there are no nightingales on Nightingale, and never were.
You would be correct. Yeah, very much so.
It's amazing what the colonial explorers decided to name pieces of rock.
Well, and species of birds. How many families does the word robin appear in? Think of at least four.
Yeah, well, I mean, you've got your English robin. We've got our Australian robins, which are quite distinct. Uh, the American robin is a thrush, I think.
It is a
Is that
thrush. Yep.
right? And there are Southeast Asian robins, but I think most of them are scrub robins
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
rather than just named robins. But
yeah.
I think they've I think India's got some birds called robins as well.
It wouldn't surprise me. You get things like we've always got tits in the UK. You've got things like
Well, apparently you've got great tits.
we do. I tell you. Um, but so you've got tits, you've got babblers, the Tamalidae in Southeast Asia, and then you've got tit babblers, which are neither tit nor babbler, and something entirely different. So that was the way when you were a 19th century gentleman ornithologist from probably Europe, you went around naming things.
I I can understand people naming things based on what the similarity in what something looks like, but I can't understand why you would call a subantarctic rock nightingale. Maybe maybe he'd just
I
been
mean,
writing some romantic poetry or something, and
or it could be named after somebody or a ship, or there are two land birds on the island. So there's Wilkins finch and nightingale finch, which again are not finches, but actually not finches, but actually tanagers, sometimes called
yeah.
buntings. So yeah, who knows?
I wonder if the origin of those two were as vagrants that had arrived there. Maybe a couple of them had arrived during a terrible storm or something, or because they probably had their origins in South America. One would have to think.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Martin Stavanger, who's at the National Museum Scotland, is working on this, and it's a fantastic radiation, very similar to what we see in the Galapagos with Galapagos finches, in terms of the different taxa that inhabit the different islands in the Tristan Archipelago, and how they arrived and when they arrived in relation to the age of the island. So yeah, I can't say too much about that just now, but yeah, stay tuned. It's a really fascinating story.
Let's talk seabirds for just a second before I go off on another tangent, an interesting paper that you had been working on. But were was the production of oil from the seabirds part of life on Tristan?
Less so from birds and more from things like elephant seals and fur seals. So and that's common across many of the islands in the Southern Ocean. So one of the beaches on Tristan is called Tripot, which is for the three-legged cauldron, basically, that was used to render. But yeah, I mean, penguins in particular would have been targeted, whereas the other bigger birds, like the albatrosses, they would have been more used for eating.
And I forgot what you told me about what other islands were close to Tristan. I think you said Gough. Was that right?
Gough is about 380 kilometers south. So in the grand scheme of things, it's
Nearby.
Closer than just about anything else.
Neighbours. So, have they? Who have been the colonial powers over time who have administered the nearby islands? Like, have they been French territories, or have they been exclusively British territories, or have maybe the Argentinians had some of them for a while.
No, so Gough and Tristan were first discovered by the Portuguese in the 1500s, but they weren't really inhabited or claimed until 1815 or 14, when Napoleon was exiled to Saint Helena. So the British garrisoned Tristan da Cunha, because even though it's about 2,000 kilometers away, it was the nearest point of land, and they didn't want the French to garrison the island and possibly, break them free again. Um, but prior to that, there was no inhabitation. It was, a random island in the middle of the ocean that people would go to and visit, sometimes taking fur seals and elephant seals. But Tristan, Nightingale, Inaccessible, and Gough have been under British, at least nominal control since, for at least 200 years.
Now, Martin's just popped into the stream a little bit late. So can we talk about that geography again of Tristan and Gough and its proximity to South Africa and its proximity to Antarctica?
Yeah. So it's actually Tristan's at 37 degrees south. So, not too far, but that's more or less the same latitude as Cape Town. So if you go basically due west of Cape Town for 10 days, you get to Tristan, and then Gough is just about 40 degrees south. So not quite roaring 40s. But yeah, smack dab in the middle of the South Atlantic.
And in relation to South Georgia,
more than 1,000 kilometers away.
Okay. So I only brought that in because the photo behind me is from South Georgia, thanks to Steph Burrell. Good on you, Steph. So yeah, Martin says cheers. All right, we'll move away from Tristan and take a hard left turn before we circle back to seabirds. But this article, and again, it's one that you've popped out this year, and that you're only a co-author of it. But I've got to get some comment because this bird is one that is just cool because of the way it does its it prances. It's not really the right word. How woodcocks produce the most brilliant white plumage patches among the birds. Now, I've never noticed white plumage patches on woodcocks. So tell us about this paper.
That's very good because that's the whole point. So European woodcock, have on the undersides of their tails this incredibly bright white. And like all visual signals, it's a fine balance, right? It's either incredibly showy and then everybody sees it, or you only bring it out for those very special occasions because otherwise everybody will see it. So, the fact that you haven't seen it is perfect, and that's the whole point. So woodcock display around dusk, and they do these fantastic acrobatics and displays. And one of them includes flashing this tail, the underside of their tail feathers. And a friend of mine, Jamie Dunning, who's a PhD student at Imperial here in the UK, was having a think about this and noticed it was incredibly white, and brighter white than a lot of other species that we think of when we think of like bright white feathers. Like some terns or snowy owls or something like that. And so he put together this amazing team, like properly amazing team of some folks that studied coloration, some folks that looked at the physics of light, and basically was able to show that if you think of like a Venetian blind, with the sort of the slats that go down, that's how they are able to reflect so much light. And when we measured it, and I don't know all of the details or all the technical side of it, but when we measured it, it was the whitest white in a bird that had ever been measured. And that includes things like white-capped manakins, who have this incredibly brilliant, shocking white bit on their head. And when we looked across across all those sort of the woodcock and snipe, which was my job, we found it was restricted just to the species in skull packs. So things like Gallinago snipe, common snipe, some of the extinct giant snipe from New Zealand, they didn't have this. It was only the 6 or 8 species of like proper snipe, but they all had this. And the top of the feather is brown, and then the underside is this incredibly brilliant white.
Wow, I'm really going to be looking at some woodcock photos. Is it actually the underside of the tail feathers, or is it the coverts around the rump that are the white patch?
It is the feather. It is just the underside. So the tops of the feathers are brown, and the undersides of that same feather are this brilliant white.
Okay. Wow.
Which is absolutely, fascinating and amazing.
Okay. Well, I'm going to have to. Hopefully, are there some good pictures in that paper?
We've got an image of what the display looks like in the paper that was published in Journal of the Royal Society Interface earlier this year by Jamie Dunning and co.
Yeah, and is that open access?
It is, yes, indeed.
Right. Okay. Cool. All right. I think we have to talk about the work that you were doing on Lord Howe Island and plastic pollution generally, and we'll see where that discussion takes us. So, first, I'm interested in how you got involved in the fleshy-footed shearwater project that Adrift were doing. So, of course, when we spoke to Jen Lavers and to Alex
Jersey.
The Three Musketeers, I want to call them, but no, it's really interesting, different focus that each one of the students had for the purposes of their projects. But how did you get involved? Because Adrift was part of University Tasmania and Lord Howe's in the Pacific, and you're over there in Hertfordshire, and you're Canadian by birth. So how did you get involved in that project?
Yeah. So Jen and I have been working together for almost 20 years, in a variety of things, and back in 2007, we started working on a project looking at flesh-footed shearwaters, which are these fantastically gorgeous birds that breed in Australia, New Zealand, and then migrate up to the North Pacific. And 15 years ago, the major issue with them was bycatch in fisheries, and particularly longlines off Eastern Australia. And so we had access to some birds that had been caught in fisheries in WA, in the Tasman Sea, in New Zealand. And our goal was to figure out, can we use some biochemical markers to figure out where they came from? It's a process called geographical assignment, where you sample a bunch of colonies and you measure things like stable isotopes, trace elements, and each colony, in theory, if it works, will have a specific signature. And then you can use some predictive models to say, with your unknown birds, right, what's the probability that this bird came from the Recherche Archipelago in WA, or from Lord Howe, or from the Hen and Chicken Islands in North Island, New Zealand? And so we were in the process of putting that project together. And I was a PhD student in Canada at the time. And I flew down to Australia to work with Jen to, right, fine, we're going to put this together, because we've never lived in the same country when we've worked together, and we've always managed to make things work. But sometimes you just need to be in the same room in the same time zone. and she had to go across to Lord Howe Island for a week to do some work, and I was lucky enough to tag along. So that was sort of my first introduction. And then we were there in December, so there weren't any chicks. It was just adults at the time. But you could see in the forest, sometimes you would see carcasses of birds that had plastic in their stomachs, and we knew this was sort of an issue. And then, over the years, Jen continued to go back, and I would dip in as I could, mostly from the lab side of things from Canada. So I would be analyzing the samples, and we would look at things like, how does plastic relate to contaminant burden? Or how does contaminant burden in these birds vary across their range? These questions that no one had asked before, and we were in a position to be able to answer them. And so when we started to formalize that a little bit, we created a Drift Lab. So Drift Lab isn't just an Australia-based organization. We have a UK node, which is me, and we've got researchers based here in the UK as well. So it's a bit of a distributed research group. And so, we sort of coined the name, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago for the group. And we're now in year, I don't even know, 15, 17, 18 of collecting data primarily on Lord Howe.
And primarily on the fleshy-footed shearwater. Without retracing what we talked about with Jen, what are the latest trends, or what is your thought about plastic pollution and how it's affecting? I mean, we saw that horrible video that Alex had shot, I think, with the dissection of one of the stomachs of one of the birds, and just the huge mass of plastic that came out of the bird. Mm-hmm. Is there a trend towards the plastic pollution lessening, or is it increasing?
So it varies. That's sort of the waffly answer, but that's what we found. It sort of varies from year to year. We don't know why. But the important thing to remember is that in a lot of cases, you don't need much in order for there to be a sublethal impact. So in some cases, it only takes ingesting a single piece, and that's going to start to alter things like blood chemistry, inflammatory responses. We've got a neat paper out that I can't talk about yet, but some other things. So, it's not necessarily the volume or the number of pieces. In some cases, it is literally just the presence of, and that can be, a single piece, or that could be, our record now is just over 400 pieces.
There's so much plastic already out there. It seems to me that this is a two-pronged problem in terms of winding the damage back. One, we have to stop producing the waste and letting it get into the rivers and streams, stormwater, and into the ocean. But is it possible, because of the scale of the pollution that's already out there, is it possible to clean it up?
No, is the blunt answer. And I think we need to start thinking about plastic like we think about other sort of broader contaminants in the environment. Like, nobody goes around claiming they're going to eliminate all PCBs from the environment or all mercury from the environment. Plastic is literally found everywhere, from snowfall in the Himalayas to the bottom of the Marianas Trench to the beer and salt and food that we eat. It is quite literally everywhere. And I think, as you say, that the solution really comes from turning off the tap. And some folks, fine, where we can go and we can clean up the oceans. And you've got these amazing things that go and suck all the plastic out of the ocean. But that's like rocking up to the emergency room or A&E with a gashing head wound, and then having discussions about how you're going to mop up the floor, right? The solution is to stop it from entering the environment in the first place, closing those gaps in waste management streams. Because plastic is an inescapable part of life. I'm talking to you on a computer. I'm wearing headphones, which are made of plastic. My computer is made of plastic. My keyboard is made of plastic. We rely on it for so many things in our daily lives that I think eliminating it is not practical.
Yeah, we're certainly not going back to a time where there is no plastic, but it's really the kind of products that plastic is used for, and the lifespan of those products, which is the key driver of the waste, I think. But we've seen that seabirds are ingesting plastic, and it's having all those effects in that, one, it takes up all the physical space within the digestive tract, so birds can't feed properly to start with. But then there's all the other issues about blood chemistry and maybe always being so sick, or using so much energy trying to regurgitate these foreign bodies and whatnot, which have massive health impacts. But they're causing mortality. We're never getting rid of the plastic, and at the rate that plastic is entering the oceans, I think we're probably still adding. We're adding to that amount of plastic, rather than, it's probably still 20, maybe 50 years until the whole world turns off the consumer plastic, disposable, single-use tap. So are we going to lose, do you think, are we going to lose seabird species basically because of plastic pollution?
I mean, it's a tricky question because, seabirds, as you know, face a variety of intermingled threats. So, flesh-footed shearwaters, you've got introduced predators on islands, you've got habitat loss on breeding islands, you've got bycatch in fisheries on the high seas and in territorial waters, you've got plastic pollution, you've got the effects of climate change and the warming oceans and what that's doing to the birds looking for food. Marine heat waves are becoming more common. Things like cyclones can, come through, and or severe storms can come through and total a breeding colony with increasing frequency. So, I've got to say the future is not necessarily a rosy one if you're a flesh-footed shearwater at the moment.
I probably should rephrase the question with all of those things in mind. Alex, are more seabirds going to go extinct?
Yes,
Yeah.
is the long and the short of it. And extinction obviously is a natural process as well. But as we know, the pressures that we place on biota and the planet on which we live are increasing and unsustainable. So I think it would be foolish not to assume that would be the case.
I wasn't going to ask you this, but I think we've got to this point in the conversation. A follow up from the conversation I had with Alex Lees just the other day, where we were discussing about how many species are going extinct before the modern world, society, the scientific community really knows about them. Really, before they've been described or before they've been adequately described. So with so many seabirds looking very similar, breeding in generally inaccessible places, and so often just existing outside of the regular gaze of humans, particularly people who are very interested in telling different types of birds apart. Do you think there's more species to be discovered other than by taxonomic revision in many seabird groups? And by extension, do you think that we'll only discover them as or just after they've gone extinct?
I think, across all birds, I don't think so. I think seabirds are a relatively well studied group. There's a long history of work done at sea across all of the oceans, in some of the most incredibly remote and inhospitable islands. I think there will inevitably be some, but I think if some of the most recent sort of discoveries of birds. I mean, one of them was in a park in Phnom Penh in Cambodia, that had just everyone had passed it by. I think there's islands in Southeast Asia that have not been visited by folks with Western ornithological expertise in centuries. So I reckon that's more likely where you're going to be finding these species that are genuinely new and not a taxonomic split. And they'll have their own pressures as well, from climate and habitat change and deforestation and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But seabirds, I think, I won't. Robert Cushman Murphy, who was a 20th century American ornithologist, I think was a bit too much hubris when he discovered or named in 1949 the species which we now know as Murphy's petrel. As he named it Pterodroma ultima, the final pterodroma. And we know that's not the case. There have been others that have cropped up since then. So, but I think genuinely for seabirds, I think we've got a pretty good handle on a lot of things, certainly compared to a lot of other bird groups.
Now, Martin's popped in a question that I was going to ask in a different kind of way. You did mention that there are so many threats that seabirds face in general. So I'll see if I can ask Martin's question in a slightly different way. Are there any seabirds that you're aware of that are not threatened by plastic pollution and ingestion, that there are sort of more controllable threats to them? Like, we've become very good at eradicating invasive pests on islands, and the changes in fishing practices are making a real positive influence on the amount of birds that die from or that are seriously injured from bycatch with long lines. So devices like hook pod. Are there seabirds that plastic pollution is not a threat to them, and that it's the other factors that are the major drivers?
Yeah, for sure. Especially you look at some species like like gulls, for example, regularly eat all sorts of crap, regurgitate very readily. Now, what that plastic is doing while it's in their digestive system, we don't really know. But you look at gull populations, some of them very inflated, reducing now. Plastic is still relatively uncommon in some parts of the Arctic. So species like guillemots, so Brunix guillemot, common guillemot, it's probably more food availability and hunting pressure that's driving their population changes. For species like little auk or ivory gull, it's going to be changes in sea ice. which they use for foraging during different parts of the year. So, and some species, genuinely, we have no idea what they're doing. Even some really cosmopolitan species, mass booby, pantropical breeding species, breeds on I don't know how many hundreds of islands in every ocean in the world. And we don't really have a good handle on sort of what they're doing population-wise. They might be fine, but when they're so distributed like that, you genuinely have no idea. So, but plastic is probably not a big issue for them.
You just mentioned boobies. I have to ask you whether you had paid attention to, was it the brown booby and red-footed boobies that had turned up? Was it in Scotland?
No. That would be incredible. It was off the south coast of England.
It was South Coast that turned up.
Yeah.
So, that seems extraordinarily unusual to me. But do you think in sort of a span of 400 or 500 years, do you think that sort of happened maybe, infrequently, but that it wasn't really bizarre occurrence, just that now there's so many people with telephoto lenses and good binoculars out there that got noticed?
Oh, for sure. Alex Lees is your person to talk to about vagrants, obviously. He literally wrote the book on it. But, it's a combination of the fact that we now know that there are different species and we've delineated them pretty well. We've got lots of folks out with binoculars and in particularly very large cameras that take a lot of pictures very quickly. But, the other thing is, there's lots of changing environmental conditions. 400 or 500 years ago, you're talking sort of the end-ish of the Little Ice Age. So you'll have species that were regularly occurring now, which would have been, practically unheard of then. And similarly, probably we did have X, Y, and Z show up with remarkable frequency. But now, because of just changes in marine environments and the climate generally, their distributions have shifted. So, yeah, it's not terribly surprising.
No, and these birds travel extraordinary distances.
Oh, that's it. People get really excited when albatross rock up in the UK, which we've had, several of in the last number of years. Black-browed albatross, is probably one of the most vagrant albatrosses out there. There was one that was called the King of Meechness. Meechness is an island in the Faroe Islands, and it rocked up there every year for 30 years to try and woo the gannets. Never successfully, but yeah, for 30 years, this black-browed albatross decided he was going to make, or she was going to make his or her home on this island in the Faroe Islands, north of, between Scotland and Iceland. So when one shows up in England, it's amazing because albatrosses are amazing to see, especially on the wing. But yeah, it's not terribly surprising in the grand scheme of things.
Your memory is probably better than mine, but where was the cliff that gannet, Lonesome George, the statue gannet was put in the attempt to repopulate?
Oh, I don't know.
A cliff. It's years ago. I spoke with Steph Burrell about Lonesome George. I'll look it up and try and leave the information in the description for those who are checking out later on. Let's talk about storm petrels. I think you're happy to talk about storm petrels.
Always.
I really liked the title again. A recent paper, 2023. Let's start here with quantifying gull predation in a declining leech storm petrel colony.
Yeah, this is a really tricky one. So leech storm petrels probably it's in my top 3 birds. Let's be honest. I've had the great pleasure of working on them for almost 20 years in some form or another. So they breed in the North Atlantic and North Pacific Ocean. Their main area of focus is Newfoundland. off the east coast of Canada, where you've got populations on some islands that are literally in the millions. And when I was a postdoc, this is, gosh, going back more than 10 years now, some of the work we were doing around Leach's storm petrels involved trying to figure out, population numbers. This is back when we thought there might be something going on with these guys. And a couple of surveys at some smaller sites suggested population declines. And we thought, right, well, we were on a place called, ironically enough, Gull Island, which is in Witless Bay in eastern Newfoundland, which had a reasonably large population. And we decided to do a census. And alongside that census, we replicated some work that Ian Stenhouse had done about 20 years before that, where he basically quantified how many storm petrels the gulls were eating. Now, storm petrels are fantastic for so many reasons, but they don't come back to their natal colony in general. They disperse. So, a lot of seabirds, we think, right, you're born here, you're going to come back here. In Leach's petrel, it's, in the 5 to 15, maybe 20% range, come back to their natal colony. There's a lot of dispersal, a lot of prospecting. So at night, when you have birds around, because they're nocturnal, and you hear them calling, most of those won't actually be from the island that you're on. They'll be checking it out. They'll be younger pre-breeders. And in Newfoundland, they could literally come from anywhere in the North Atlantic. Other islands in Newfoundland, they could come from Iceland. They could come from, there's a colony in the UK on St. Kilda. And they just, check the place out, might stick around for a little while, and then bugger off and check somewhere else out.
Do they, once they've found a place to nest for the first time, do they return to that location, or
Yes.
are they dispersing year after year?
No. Once they've decided, they'll stick. They'll stay around, but it's that initial sort of 2 to 5 year prospecting where they'll just wander around, and most of them will not come back to the colony from which they hatched, which is itself pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
And so when Ian did his work on an adjacent island in the late 90s, he estimated predation to be pretty significant. Tens of thousands of storm petrels a year, and fine. Most of those are going to be pre-breeding, juvenile birds, or even birds not from the colony, but some of them will be. And so we decided to do that same quantification on Gull Island a little bit later. And yeah, much to the same as Ian, we found, I think it was about 100,000 storm petrels were being eaten by, there's only about just over 2,000 pairs of herring gulls on the island. So they were definitely enjoying themselves, or at least a certain number of them were, over the summer. And, you do that by wandering around and you see a gull pellet, or a set of storm petrel wings or legs. And you can, it's relatively easy to tell that, all right, that was a gull that had a storm petrel for dinner.
How widely dispersed around the globe are Leach's storm petrel for breeding?
So there's a small colony in the UK on St. Kilda, which is
St. Kilda, yep.
Yeah, up off the west coast of Scotland. Lots of them in Iceland. Huge area of breeding is Newfoundland, but sort of from there down the coast into Maine. I think there's a few pairs that go a little bit further south than that. And in the Pacific, they breed on the northern islands of Japan, all up the Kuril Islands, up into Kamchatka, across the Aleutians, down the southeast Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California, down to the Channel Islands. And some of them, although they were just recently split, we were talking about taxonomic splits, are on Guadalupe Island off Mexico, although that's now a separate species. So pretty wide range in the Pacific in terms of breeding sites.
So the purpose of asking you that question is, do you know whether it's gulls generally, like gulls that are the size of herring gulls, that will predate them, or is it especially herring gulls?
I mean, look, it'll be, so in Japan it's blacktail gulls eat them. In the Aleutians it's glaucous wing gulls that eat them. Down the coast of California, it's going to be western gulls. So it's whatever your large Larus gull of choice is. If you're a storm petrel, is going to be the one eating you.
And is that their major predator?
Primarily, they're obviously affected by things like introduced predators. So rats and mice in particular tend to exterminate them from islands. Foxes as well. In the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, foxes were introduced for fur farming on quite a few islands, and that basically totaled all the sort of nocturnal burrow nesting seabirds in those places, because the foxes would just absolutely go to town. And then, in terms of avian predators, it's gulls, and then in some places you get an owl who has a particular taste for storm petrels, but they tend to not stick around, and it's usually only one or two.
And I mean, skuas, are they also large predators?
I mean, they are. The only place where they really overlap is you're thinking bonksies, like great skuas. They'll certainly take them in the UK and Iceland, and the Faroes where they also occur. I think some of the Arctic skua, they are less likely to eat them than the bonksies are.
So in all of those locations that you've just mentioned where they are breeding, most of them would have rodents, rats and mice particularly, naturally occurring there?
No, exactly not. So, and this is the whole point about seabirds, is they breed on these offshore islands to avoid predators, and it's only because these predators have been introduced that they occur there. So
sorry to stop you there, but I'm really interested that there could be like offshore islands off the coast of the US, like off Maine, where there are not invasive species.
Yes, amazing, isn't it?
It is. That kind of staggers me. Have they been depopulated, or have they just never got there?
A combination of both, I think. Certainly in the US, the number of islands in which they breed, I mean, it's not huge, and they tend to be fairly far offshore. So even the biggest Norway rat can only swim about 2 miles. So it's just down to your biosecurity and your boat operations really that keep them from going there. But there are places in Maine, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland that have never had introduced rodents.
And are these islands that offer people very little? Is that one of the reasons that like the most remote islands in the South Pacific and the South Atlantic have had rats and mice jumping off ships over hundreds of years? So why do you think it is that hasn't happened to islands that are relatively close in proximity to the colonizers? I mean, Iceland are the Vikings, right? So
Iceland. I don't know what the situation is for rodents there. Certainly in the Faroes, I know it's an issue on some places. North America, a lot of these islands are rocky, not really inhabitable. They don't have fresh water. They're small in the grand scheme of things.
So they're not offering anything to people, so no one's going there. Yeah.
The only thing that's really there are the birds.
Are the seabirds. So if you're really, really hungry, you might stop off and grab a couple of fat chicks.
Yeah, exactly. If you're not shooting them from your boat anyway.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. That really does astound me that particularly rats that they hadn't got to these islands. I mean, I'd been labouring under the misapprehension that they were pretty much ubiquitous and that we were having to eradicate them. It's nice to know that there's places that they still haven't got. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's places, in the Aleutian Islands, they're pretty remote as it is, but obviously, have a long history of human habitation. But, places like Buldir Island, which is in the Western Aleutians, has never had introduced foxes, rats, or mice. And I think it's the most diverse seabird colony in the northern hemisphere. There's about 23 or 24 breeding species of seabirds on this tiny little island, millions of individuals, because precisely, this reason. It had, Aleut inhabitants up until I think the certainly before 1800. I don't know when they finally left. But yeah, this seabird mecca.
So with a species like leeches, leeches storm petrel, which is so widely distributed, certainly around the northern hemisphere, but also is seen in southern oceans as well.
Yep.
But breeding in the north, is it? Or are there a lot of subspecies within such a largely? It's almost a cosmopolitan species, or has its strategy of them all leaving the nest and dispersing meant that the genetics are pretty tight?
There was a student, I think, who is or has just finished working on that, and I don't know what the story is. I think I think there's maybe 3 or 4 subspecies, which is not. I mean, it's reasonably high for a seabird, but there's some seabirds out there that might have 5 or 6. Things. Especially some of the tropical terns. Every little island seems to have a slightly different population, subspecies of sooty tern, for example, or white tern, or some of the noddies. So yeah, I think for leeches, I think now there's maybe 3 or 4 subspecies, but they're not, I think, morphologically that well defined as a lot of them are. So yeah, we'll wait to see what the genetics says.
Yeah, see what the blood typing and is it feather work or is it blood typing that's really being done?
If you want really good quality genomic data, then it's tissue. So that can be either blood or muscle or liver or something like that. If you've got a museum specimen, you take tissues, as we do. They get stored in liquid nitrogen or -80. You can get quite a bit of material from a toe pad. So in museums, that's mostly what we will sample. For molecular work, you can get entire mitochondrial genomes from a toe pad these days, and I suspect it won't be long before you can do much, much more.
I've got no idea how this stuff is done, Alex. So if you're going to sample from a toe pad, how fresh does that bird need to be? Like, can you go back and sample specimens that have been in the display cases?
So usually if they're displayed, that means their feet are pretty trashed because they've been mounted in some way. Most of the specimens, so that would be like this fellow here.
I was waiting for you to come in. I'd given you an opportunity.
Well done. So this is a little a Barola shearwater, and he's mounted, so he's got glass eyes. He's got wires coming out of his legs that you can see here, and he would have been on a wooden base or something like that. This is how a lot of display specimens were prepared. But what most research specimens are called study skins. So they're flat, laying on their back. That's cotton wool poking through the eyes. They don't have glass eyes. The feet aren't posed. There's no wires. And so you can sample that relatively easily. And we've gotten whole mitogenomes from birds that are over 200 years old.
So for the audio audience, Alex, what were you just holding up?
Yeah, right. So the first one, this is a Barola shearwater. It's mounted. It's sitting on a piece of plastizote, which is a little bit of plastic base. And then,
do you know the history of that specimen? Can you tell us where that came from, when it was collected?
Yeah, this is an early English specimen from the south coast of England in the 1860s. And then this is the next one that I'm holding up is a study skin of an inaccessible rail. So we mentioned Inaccessible Island earlier, off Tristan da Cunha. It's the smallest flightless bird in the world. It weighs about 30 grams. It's all black. It's basically got no wings. It's more or less fluff. And this was collected on Inaccessible Island in 1928.
Is it still with us, the Inaccessible Rail?
It is very much still with us.
Very good.
And doing reasonably well, all things considered, because Inaccessible has no introduced predators.
Magnificent. Great. Thanks for that. So you just said that you've got liquid nitrogen. Are they vats? Like we've all seen the TV shows where the top is lifted off and the
Yep.
and the mist. I mean, that's a gas, isn't it?
That's the liquid nitrogen.
That's evaporating off,
Yep.
and then there's things like a soup ladle hanging off the.
I mean, not quite a soup
lid.
ladle.
but that's kind of what the evocation is you see the hook.
Yeah.
It's like it looks like a big soup ladle or something coming out. So you've got how many vats of liquid nitrogen have you got access to, and approximately how many specimens have you got?
So the NHM's tissue collection is housed in London, so I don't know, exactly what their setup is. We don't use ladles, you'll be pleased to know. They're giant racks that you lift out, and they've got, trays in them, several layers deep. I think we've got, I wouldn't be able to guess, but, maybe 4 to 8 ish. I have no idea. A lot of the tissue that we collect goes into -80 freezers. And in birds, we've got, I think now, about 2,500 tissue samples.
Now, I'm wondering, I don't really know whether that's a lot or whether it's like whether you're very judicious about the species that go into storage.
So we do this from all of our freshly prepared material. So we try and take tissue samples from everything that gets freshly prepared, and we've done that pretty consistently for the last 10 years. But certainly we've got our oldest tissue samples we started taking about 25 years ago. So in the grand scheme of things, in the museum collection, we've got 1 million bird specimens across skins, skeletons, the alcohol collection, eggs and nests. There's 1 million specimens. So 2,000 is just a drop in the bucket. But when you think about, that's basically birds that have been added to the collection in the last 20 years. That's not doing too badly.
Well, it's high maintenance, isn't it, to ensure that these specimens don't get degraded, because the power can never go off. I imagine.
Yeah, but that's an emergency generator. It's all tractable. It's all tractable problems. But yes.
Yeah. But I mean, it's different than having a couple of glass-fronted cupboards, right? So that's what I'm getting at. That. So
you also wouldn't have glass-fronted cupboards. You would have cabinets that are ideally conservation grade, not made of wood. Yeah. Don't allow UV in. So every collection storage medium has its particular vagaries.
So the point of the meandering introduction is, how do you select the species that are going to go into the liquid nitrogen collection and that you're sampling?
Basically,
I mean, do people donate bird strike window collision birds to the museum? Or,
yeah.
And do you take them for that, or are you out on expeditions to find particular species that you want to sample?
So I think there's two questions there. One is how do we add specimens to the collection in general, and then the second one is how do we decide what gets sampled for the tissue collection? So the tissue collection is from specimens that we prepare for either the skin collection or the skeleton collection. And because it's still relatively new, basically everything that we can will get a tissue sample taken from a new prep. In terms of how we add to the collection, we don't do expeditions at the moment, which is more or less just a logistical and financial decision. It's really challenging to go out and do these sorts of things, especially these days, to make sure that you're doing them lawfully with all the appropriate permits and licenses, and all the preservation kit that you still need. So most of the stuff that we get is comes primarily from three sources. One is, yes, Joe Bloggs down the road has a blackbird that hit his window. Will we take it? Yes. The other is we've got a really good network of wildlife carers and wildlife hospitals. So, when they have an animal that dies in their care, they'll often give us a call. And then the third is historic collections. So, and this is particularly true for things like eggs, which was, quite a popular pastime, egg collecting in Britain, until it was made illegal in the 20th century. So either smaller museums that are looking to dispose of their bird collections, private individuals, other organizations, private schools who say, "Oh, my father has an egg collection that my grandfather died, and his father gave him an egg collection," that sort of thing. So a lot of the stuff that we get, like this Barola shearwater that we were talking about earlier, this fine fellow. He's from the 1860s, but he was donated to the museum by a private school who was looking to get rid of some of their bird collection. So we only acquired it about 2 years ago. So an older specimen, but a recent acquisition for us.
I imagine that there would be a lot of taxonomic collections that would be offered, because they're quite difficult things for people to hang on to if they're downsizing. Like if they're downsizing from their stately home,
Oh, taxidermy, you mean?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Did I say taxonomic?
Taxonomic collections. Sorry. Oh, yeah.
So,
yeah. And to be honest, so for us, and this is in general, if anyone's listening, and you're in the UK, certainly, if you come across a dead bird and it's got data, this is the key for us. We need to know when and where it died. We can usually figure out what it is, although if it's an egg or a nest, we'll need the species ID as well. It's got to be obtained lawfully, and then we can start having the conversation about whether it will make an addition to the museum collection. So things like mounts, this taxidermy collection, we will take them, but only if they have reasonable amounts of data with them. Because we have a finite amount of space. We have a limited collection of mounts that we use for exhibitions, which don't generally have data. They're meant for displays and galleries and education and outreach. So sometimes we might funnel some specimens through there. If it's someone says, "Oh, do you want this mounted Albert's lyrebird," which is from a small population in northeastern Australia. So yeah, because we won't have many specimens of Albert's lyrebird. But if someone says, "Oh, do you want this, this common pheasant that's got no data?" We will probably pass.
One of the sad pieces of news in the last few months, Alex, was the removal of 20 odd, I think 23 or 27 species of birds from the endangered list in the US, because they're now all extinct, and I think most of them were Hawaiian birds. Does the Museum of Natural History have not a lot, but many specimens of that kind of, or those taxa? Because, I mean, the Brits were out and about at the time that those societies in the Pacific were sort of becoming known to Western societies. So, do you hold a lot of Hawaiian birds?
So we do, and that's largely thanks to quote unquote the chap named Walter Rothschild, who had a particular interest in Hawaii and island birds, and funded several expeditions out to some of the most remote islands in Hawaii, Laysan in particular. He funded an expedition there. in the early 20th century. So so we do have a lot of extinct and endangered specimens in the collection, which reflects the long history of ornithological collecting that funneled specimens back to Britain and the networks that those fed into. It's always a bit sobering when we think about removing species from protected species lists because they're extinct. I think in the U.S. it's quite a particular situation where there's that legislative instrument which carries with it certain obligations, where that might mean that having a species on there that is unlikely to be still extant, actually impedes something. But it's important to remember that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is not the final arbiter of whether a species is extinct or not. That's the species assessments done for the IUCN Red List. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Endangered Species Act will also list subspecies. So take your pick about how valid is the subspecies if that goes extinct, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, it's absolutely terrible news, but I think we've got to put it into the appropriate context of a very American legislative bit of thinking about how that species list is generated.
Now, forgive me, I'm going to go off on a tangent here, just because I noticed that you'd co-authored a paper with Kevin Burgio, and we did. I spoke to Kevin about the extinction of the Carolina parakeet.
Yep.
Now, I don't want to ask you about the Carolina parakeet.
Okay.
I do want to ask you. Ivory-billed woodpecker,
yep.
Yes or no? Is it still out there?
No.
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 Okay. Very definitive.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely definitive. Yeah. It is sadly gone. And interestingly, not one of the 23 species recently delisted under the Americans Endangered Species Act.
They're hanging on to it, aren't they? For dear life.
They seem to be.
It's very much like the Yeti and the bunyip here,
No, unfortunately, unfortunately for ivory bills, they are no more.
Yeah, well, people are still out there looking for the paradise parrot too, Alex. So, it's crazy, isn't it? Like, the Carolina parakeet is an interesting one, and this will let me lead back to the slender-billed curlew.
Excellent.
I'll get there.
We love a segue.
Okay. And this is asking you to project and to hypothesize a little bit.
Okay.
Both the Carolina parakeet and the passenger pigeon were extraordinarily common birds in their time. The Eskimo curlew, as well, was like one of the commonest birds for people who were out on the plains and the prairies in North America at the time of the westward expansion in the US. Do you think we're likely now to find some of the most common species that we're familiar with? And I always come back to the house sparrow because that was sort of a bird that is being noticed declining in many of the places that it was really common. Do you think we're going to see such a common species disappear due to the number of pressures that we're putting on birds? Like, we can't just say it's climate change.
No,
it's habitat
absolutely.
loss. It's invasive species. It's introductions of other competitor species. So do you think we're going to lose like another species that is so common, or have we learned a little bit more?
I think it would be foolish to think that we wouldn't. You only have to look at things like, it's a classic case of shifting baseline. What's noticeable or normal for today is very unlike what the natural world was like, in the lifetime of some of the folks listening. How many, I can't remember how many billions of birds individuals have been lost in Europe in the last 50 years, but it is on that order of magnitude.
Well, just from window strike alone, in the North American flyway and indeed in the European African flyway, it's estimated to be at least 1 billion birds every year in each flyway.
Yeah, and cats in North America will be about the same order of magnitude.
So we're losing three. So that means we're losing 3 billion
that's
birds.
Three.
Yeah, that's before we've added in the other flyways, because it's probably similar numbers in the Asia Pacific, East Asia Pacific flyway.
Yep.
But maybe most of those birds don't get noticed when they're dying. I don't know, but
I mean, look, are we going to?
We're not replenishing, are we? We're just not replenishing.
No, exactly, and this is the perpetual challenge of conservation organizations and government bodies charged with conservation of native birds. Is you've got the stuff that's not doing so great, but then you've also got you want to keep the common stuff common. And there's the British Trust for Ornithology in the UK has a fantastic web app where if you enter your postcode, it tells you what birds have been lost in your area since 1970.
Oh, wow. Is that right?
Based on breeding bird surveys and national atlasing. So I can go to my house and I can type in my postcode and I can see, right, this is what I have today. This is what was reported in the last atlas or the last breeding bird survey in that square. And you can compare that to the 70s and you think, blimey. And literally, it takes it home to that individual level. And all it takes is for enough of those squares adjacent to be losing the same species, and that's your extinction.
Okay, I can't let you go since you brought that up. You've obviously done that for your house, for your place. So what do you lament that isn't flying across your yard?
I mean, so I've only lived in the UK for about 10 years, so I don't have that same sort of knowledge about what things were like in the dim and distant past. But just things like skylarks and corn buntings were reasonably common in my area in the 1970s. They're definitely not on my yard list, and I wouldn't think today that they would even be on my yard list. It would be an exceptionally amazing thing if I had a skylark or a corn bunting rock up. Or yellowhammer.
What a stunning bird the yellowhammer is. I mean, have you got turtle doves?
So another great example. Turtle doves in the UK have plummeted by I don't know how many percent in the last 40 years. We certainly don't have them where I live now. I think historically they used to be there. It's certainly within their range. But there's a great example of a bird that was reasonably common that still faces massive pressures today that we may or may not see in Europe in another 50 years.
Now, when I think about the UK from so far away, from down in the Antipodes, I think that many places have been cleared, urbanised, deforested, turned into largely agricultural systems or suburbs and villages. So has there been really significant change to the landscape across, well, certainly in the area that you're familiar with in the UK, between the 70s and now? Like, has land use changed so much in that locality? Do you think?
So I think some of it certainly. as much as we lament the lack of recent housing stock in the UK, there is still ongoing development. There's changes in agricultural practice, when and how often and which crops are harvested, which impacts a lot of farmland birds that we have in the UK.
Okay.
Skylarks, are a great example of that. So that's the conversation that I think we're having. But you're absolutely right. I mean, in England, you're no more than, I think it's 3 miles from a designated road, anywhere in the country, and that's certainly not a uniform distribution in terms of, in the south of England, it's pretty hard to get more than a mile away from a road. But yeah, forest wise, I think the oldest tree in all of the UK is only about 400 years old. So it's compared to Canada where I grew up, it's a massively different landscape with, massively different conservation challenges. We're also edge of range for a lot of common European species. Species like corncrake that are, not quite tripping over them once you get to mainland Europe, but which just have a tiny little toe in the UK. So there's a lot of conservation effort spent on corncrake, which is a tough one to, in my view, a tough one to justify given, the other pressures that we have. But again, the challenge of trying to keep your common stuff common, keep ranges where they are, while also protecting the stuff that's less common.
From afar, looking at the Twitter feeds and whatnot, there seems to be a real strong movement to do rewilding and reforestation, repairing sort of degraded habitat in the UK. But am I right with getting that sense in the UK, or is it that the comms people are so good at spreading the word, but that the needle isn't really being shifted? And there's a reason for asking the question, but I'll get to
forestation wise. I don't think. I don't think that one has really taken off. Rewilding is certainly more and more in the national discourse, whether that's European beaver or sea eagles. I think, there's limited appetite for anything. We're not going to be reintroducing European wolves anytime soon, I don't think, for example.
So, is the situation in the UK generally, like for the preservation of existing habitat, and I'm using the term very broadly because it's nearly it is all altered habitat,
not a square inch of this country is unaltered.
So, but it is serving as habitat, and let's talk about birds, but there's also hedgehogs and other creatures that are, under real pressure.
Yep. Water voles, you name them.
So I'm interested in your thought because you're a transplant. You've come in from Canada and so you can look at Britain in perhaps a way that the English and the British might not. Same way that I probably don't look at Australia the same way that you would. But do you think that the conservation scales are changing in the UK, or is it just the same old story? It's just dressed up a different way.
I mean, I think my impression is that conservation in the UK has always been, well, maybe not as always, but certainly has a history of being quite insular and provincial. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but very.
Can I put a different tag on it? Because the way I see it always seems to me to be very gentlemanly or very.
Yes.
It seems to be, and I think it's a lot the same here, no doubt, and probably everywhere. Conservation's a very class-based thing. I think that's the best way to say it. And look, I'll extend it a little bit further out. I've got lots of friends in the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia. I don't know anyone who is not an expat from those countries. Oh, actually, no, that's not true. I do know one person in the Philippines. But all the people I know in the Philippines think I'm a nutcase because I'm interested in the birds that fly past. It's just not something that working people, just regular people in that society are into. It's very class-based there too, I would imagine. I think it's the same here, and I'm wondering, is it the same in the UK, that most people don't give conservation a second glance unless it's something fluffy and pretty that pops up on the TV?
I mean, I think the challenge that we have in the UK is that it's, and I'll extend this broadly to just sort of interaction with nature and the natural world, such as it is in the UK, is very is not uniform across socioeconomic status. So there's certainly, you know, communities where just getting folks out into a nature reserve is a huge thing. So the RSPB, I think, just this week announced that it was making entry to all of its reserves free for under 24s.
I did see that. I just saw that today, I think, on the Twitter feed, which I think,
which is brilliant.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
You know, and there's work that we're doing at the NHM to look at particularly some of these underserved communities and trying to get them more engaged and involved and think about the natural world, which is really tricky when you live in a city like London, which has 8 million people, and, you know, is pretty densely packed for the most part. So yeah, you know, thinking about and prioritizing conservation efforts obviously comes from, you know, those people who have had the time to think about it, had the time to think that, oh yes, this is important because of X, Y, and Z, and have the capacity to prioritize that in their sort of hierarchy of things that they care about. And I think that manifests itself in the UK in a slightly interesting way, where, you know, a bird can't sneeze, I think, without somebody watching it. I mean, it's a bit of a joke, but, you know, the number of people that engage, particularly in bird watching and twitching, and people keep county lists and national lists, which is all great and wonderful and fantastic. And it means we've got probably one of the best documented bird communities, populations, however you want to call it, anywhere in the world. Which I guess is part of the reason why I don't do any of my research in the UK, because you guys have got it sorted out. So I work in, you know, Canada and Australia, and Tristan da Cunha. So, you know, but yeah, there is absolutely a class-based aspect to it. You know, there's no ways about it, and you know, that I think you could say about just about anything in the UK, is my observation.
Is that one of the handbrakes to real action on biodiversity preservation, and we can link that to climate change? Because the masses really still aren't really connected and engaged to the issue.
So I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think, you know, in the UK, you've got the RSPB, which is the largest environmental charity in Europe. It's got over 1 million members. You know, the UK has 65 million people. So that's almost, you know, 2% of the population is a member of this one environmental charity, and that's not counting.
That's massive, isn't it?
And that's huge, and that's not counting, you know, your local wildlife trust or your local naturalist club or the British Trust for Ornithology or any of the other, you know, similar groups that focus on other different taxa. I think, you know, the challenge that we have in the UK is this disconnect, because so many people. I grew up on the Bay of Fundy in Eastern Canada, highest tides in the world, you know, 30 meters. between low and high tide. And that experience of like, I could go hiking and not see anybody for an entire day. And that for me was what really connected me first with. So I fell in love with islands way before I fell in love with birds, islands and coastlines, because that was my natural world. And I think when you're in the UK and you're in and you grow up in a country that is so densely packed and has such limited opportunities to get out into nature, most RSPB reserves, for example, aren't accessible easily by public transit. So you've got to have a car. So there's impediment number one. You just don't have that same opportunity. So it doesn't get quite as ingrained. And I think that pervades all the way up through. So when we start talking about things like, preservation of beaches or marshes or something like that, they're always, oh yeah, it's just a bog, isn't
it? Are you telling me that you may have had a different career trajectory had you grown up walking the foreshore at Blackpool?
I was going to be an optometrist when I started my undergraduate, so anything is possible.
Oh, wow. That's a whole other story. But I can get your point. Actually, where you grew up with such large tides, I mean, that makes me think about the northwest Kimberley coast, Broome and whatnot. Did you have were you able to forage for big mussels?
Oh yeah,
growing on the shore. Yeah,
mussels, scallops, seaweed.
It must have been amazing.
Pickles. Oh yeah, no, it was as a kid, and particularly as a teenager, once I had a little bit more freedom, that was my days off. I would just go hiking in the woods for 2 days. It was wonderful. It was incredibly formative as a kid to be able to do that.
Coming on the next series of Alone, Alex Bond pits himself against the Canadian wilderness. Yeah.
But it was close enough that if something did go pear-shaped, that you weren't days away by boat or something like that. But it was still out of the way enough that you didn't hear a car or hear people talking, or this is the days before mobile phones or cell phones, so you didn't really have that issue to work with. But there's probably no cell reception, which is an increasingly rare thing to find these days.
Isn't it amazing how we get annoyed where there's no cell reception now?
This is reception. one of the best things about Lord Howe Island is there's no mobile phone reception.
Yeah.
By design. You can have Wi-Fi in your accommodation, but when you're outside, there's no 4G. It's brilliant.
Oh, that's good. Well, Telstra haven't taken over the island yet. Now, I want to just circle back a little bit to the state of the UK. So Martin's raised a question in the comments that the decline in populations for a lot of UK species, were they initially driven by hunting, both sporting hunting, come on chaps, we'll go and shoot some grouse, or food for people, in maybe around the Industrial Revolution time or earlier, where the peasants were trapping birds for food, and was sort of the cage bird trade something that drove population decline, sort of in early modern history?
Yeah, my sense is no. I think that the challenge the UK has, like I said, is it's edge of range. We've got a lot of migratory species that are on the sort of Afro-Palearctic flyway. So wintering in either northern Africa or sub-Saharan Africa. And so, they've got pressures not only in the UK, for example, but also when they, travel through the Med and through North Africa. I think, the challenges that we face in the UK is we're an island. we've got a limited amount of real estate, and more of that is being taken up by development. So I think a large part of it is going to be things like habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, disturbance, rather than anything direct. I mean, most of the hunting that occurs in the UK is hunting for introduced species. The sheer volume of pheasants that get released annually in the UK, which is not native, is just absolutely staggering. And for food wise, maybe a small bit, but it's not going to be a huge amount. So I think mostly it's going to be down to habitat loss, fragmentation, and disturbance.
The issue of releasing pheasants and maintaining landscapes for pheasants. How big is that an issue in day-to-day conservation politics in the UK?
Oh, massively. I mean, the folks that there's a huge lobby for shooters, and I'm not against hunting, absolutely not. Nothing better than sustainably hunted wild food. It connects people with land in ways that I think are quite unique, and I've seen that across places where I've been fortunate enough to live and work. But it is in the UK context, it is just so absolutely destructive. The burning of grouse moors, the volume of introduced pheasants, and what that does to basically to everything. And then on top of that, you've got the elephant in the room, which is the incredible amounts of raptor persecution that we have here in the UK, which is just absolutely incredible. And does it? I think it's one of those things that if you're working in those systems, this is the bugbear in the room every day. If you're working on something like farmland birds or seabirds, it probably has slightly less of an effect.
Again, I know it's not your sort of subject area, but if pheasant hunting was ceased, could there still be that industry based on hunting, based on indigenous birds, like on
probably not, because just the sheer volume. I think the biomass exceeds the biomass of all native birds released. Don't quote me on that. There was a paper that came out recently that looked at the biomass of released game birds annually in the UK in relation to the biomass of indigenous, native birds. And I think it was greater. And I don't want to put a number on it because I'll probably get it wrong. And I think the existence of that private network of landowners, to have those lands turned into anything else that would support a similar number of equally or reasonably closely huntable species, like some of the native grouse or things like that, I just don't think it would happen.
So shooting pheasants in the UK is as much a historical pastime for the English as would be Australian rules football. I mean, it's just not. Shooting pheasants is a totally imported, invented pastime. It's not something that has its roots in the, it didn't come out of the time of Robin Hood, right? It's something from, importing pretty cage birds from other parts of the world. It's a colonial.
I mean, look, there's always been things like grouse hunting, and I think when folks realize
that was the point of the question.
Yeah. That's the
homegrown hunting. but you probably have to be really good to find and shoot grouse. I think that's the point I'm getting at. Is that
and
really so? So to
and there's
make
not quite as many
shooting,
of them.
yeah, and to make shooting a more rewarding pastime, they've invented a new sort of hunting by
Uh,
by breeding pheasants and then releasing them.
exactly. Yeah. It's yeah, because people like going out and like bagging a pheasant.
So how is there still resistance to it? Like how can this is where I often get frustrated is that you'll have people who want to make really cogent, sensible arguments about conservation and habitat retention, maybe about the fens or maybe some remote part of Wales, but then they can't transplant the logic of preserving habitat and biodiversity and everything, and then pop it onto something they like to do, which might be shooting pheasants.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, and I don't know what the answer is. To be honest.
Uh, is there a groundswell in mainstream media and sort of Joe average public to phasing it out, or is there a really strong rearguard action to keep pheasant hunting going based on tradition, no doubt?
Yeah, I don't. To be honest, I don't think. I mean, it's tricky because we exist in this sort of conservation bubble,
the
as
bubble,
you sort of
yeah.
alluded to earlier. So is there a massive letter writing campaign to the national newspapers to ban grouse shooting? Probably not really. There might be sort of one day a year when the season opens that you'll see a few coordinated efforts, but there's not the huge amount of like the amount of political pressure that would be needed. I think greatly exceeds what folks are going to put in, just because it is the purview of the upper class, and the UK is still a very class based society for the most part. So we're still arguing about fox hunting and doing it with or without dogs. And we've been having that conversation for 20 years. So, yeah, I don't see this changing anytime soon, unfortunately.
Another question come in. Has hunting woodcocks, snipes, and other game birds been a big historical pastime in the UK, and is it still ongoing?
I think
and ducks. Let's talk about ducks as
Oh
well.
gosh,
People are still
okay.
blasting endangered ducks out of the air.
Well, I don't think we have any endangered ducks left in the UK.
That's a good thing. We've removed them from the endangered species list. We've managed to remove them.
I mean, certainly things like snipe and woodcock. I think they're hunted, but not in huge numbers. They're certainly hunted in Europe, where again a lot of these species will migrate. Turtle dove is another great example of that. Duck hunting, I mean, probably, but it would be stuff like mallard and teal, and not in ways that I think are really impacting the populations all that hugely.
Were there? I mean, I don't know much about ducks in the UK. I did notice that you had a paper on ducks. Here we go. You weren't the lead author or anything, but binocular vision and foraging in ducks, geese, and swans. But were there more species of ducks in recent history in the UK?
Pass.
You don't know? No, I don't know that.
That's not a. Yeah. That's not something I can quickly answer.
Yeah, no, I don't know either. I'm thinking there's widgeons and gargany and shovelers and mallards and.
I mean, certainly the species that we have now, I'm sure were more abundant in the recent past, but there equally there has been quite a lot of increased work around looking at wetland bird populations. The British Trust for Ornithology's Wetland Bird Survey, which is a monthly count of all wetland birds, has certainly contributed to that. That's been going on since the 50s, I think, possibly earlier. So yeah, the data might exist for someone to do a big deep dive into that.
Ducks are cool. Now, I know we're getting away with time, but I do want to ask you about the eggs of the lost slender-billed curlew.
Yeah.
Since you have a slender-billed curlew there with you,
we do have a slender-billed curlew. There he is.
And I wanted to. I mean, we mentioned the Eskimo curlew earlier on, which was one of the most plentiful birds on the North American continent, and that is now lost. There's been really great efforts in the UK to change some farming practices so that curlews can hang on because they're a ground nesting bird and they get harvested. Their nests get harvested.
Yep.
By some of the farming practices, so that's changing. You're no doubt familiar with the work that Mary Colwell has done to promote the curlews, and also getting. I'm not sure. Is it actually called environmental studies into the what do you call it? Year 11 there, the GCSE. That's what it's called.
Oh yeah. That's there'll be a natural history GCSE
history
in a couple of years, I think.
Yeah, so well done to Mary. But let's talk about the slender-billed curlew. What happened?
So I mean, strange bird. Used to breed. We think they're probably extinct. The last properly confirmed sighting was 1995 in Morocco. They bred in central Russia on the Kazakh steppe, and then migrated west through Europe, through Greece, Hungary, Italy, and then down into North Africa. So properly weird sort of east-west migration. They were never terribly common, but they were very tasty, as you can imagine, sort of a large-ish, fat, migratory shorebird or wader. So a lot of the specimens from the mid-19th century have localities such as the market in Torino, or because they would have been procured at the market. So for a long time, folks thought there was just a single egg that was in the Manchester Museum, and through a long laborious process of tracking down many dead ends, we were able to actually find several more in a bunch of other museum collections in the US, where else do we find one? In a private collection in Russia, possibly some in Belgium. So I think there's 5 or 6 clutches supposedly of slender-billed curlew eggs out there, as opposed to just the single one. Lots of specimens. There's several. It's got to be at least more than 100 specimens out there. Like I said, because they were so common and hunted, they were relatively easy to procure. So this fellow came from Egypt in spring. So on his way back to the central steppe region of Asia, in the mid 1800s. So
being a east-west migrant rather than a north-south migrant, they're probably not likely to be hiding, unnoticed within, flocks of other waders, other curlews and sandpipers. So.
Yeah, it's pretty tricky. There's been a lot of work since 1991, in particular. I mean, the decline was noticed, in the late 80s and early 90s. And so there's been a really thorough effort to document anything that's sort of rocked up particularly since 1991. And there's been a few close cases. So there's quite a famous one in the UK, which turned out to be just a Eurasian curlew, Numenius arquata, and a group that's gotten really good at, being able to assess the records and specimens. So yeah, we think we've pretty much got them all. There's about 1,300 records that are that exist, and that some of those go back to the 1700s in terms of museum specimens, but also written records and more recent sightings. So yeah, the next step is to analyze those and see what our extinction models suggest for if they're still around.
So, do you think that the slender-billed curlew was one of those birds that may have gone naturally extinct, or was there a human-induced driver in the reduction of the population?
It's tricky to say because there's a lot that we don't know about on their breeding grounds. There's only 2 nests were ever located, and they were located in the early 20th century. And as any student of history will know, there was a lot of agricultural intensification in that neck of the woods from the 1920s through the 1970s. That undoubtedly had some effect on them. Couple that with really, quite heavy hunting pressure through migratory routes in the 19th century. So, I think we certainly didn't help things along. And I reckon they probably could have hung around if we hadn't made life quite so difficult for them.
The 5-year plans didn't take into account the slender-billed curlews, I'm guessing.
Yeah, evidently not.
Yeah, Uncle Joe wasn't thinking about the slender-billed curlew. Alex, you mentioned your childhood on the coast of Canada with. Now that's on the east coast of Canada, yeah.
Yeah.
And that you weren't a bird nerd to start with.
Definitely not.
When did you become a card-carrying member of the bird nerd herd?
Oh, right. Well, I didn't realize we got cards. I'm going to speak to somebody about that.
Someone I know is producing the bird herd, I think. So coming up. So
there tuned. We go. Okay, right. Yeah. So like I said, I grew up on the coast, and fell in love with coast and islands, and of course those are natural havens for a lot of birds. And I was really fortunate in my undergrad. I had a prof who came along in my 3rd and 4th year as a maternity cover, actually. And in those 2 years, I went to a small liberal arts university in Eastern Canada. He taught ornithology, mammalogy, conservation biology, and field ecology. And I had, the idea that these were even things that you could study, let alone get a job in, was just completely unheard of to me at that time. So I just, as soon as after that first, few classes, like this is fun. And that's where it sort of happened.
Liberal arts college, that sounds terribly woke, Alex.
I mean, so it's an undergraduate only small university. But in North America, they're often called "quote unquote" liberal arts colleges, where you take not just a strict science degree, but you also take courses in humanities, arts, and social sciences as well.
So that makes me think that you must have been introduced to some history subjects, and you must have liked them at that stage, because so much of your work in conservation biology seems to have a very strong history bent.
So actually, no, I never took a course in history, and I think I've used before I even started working at the museum here. I've been a museum collections user for years before. And they are those sort of archives of the natural world. And I think the more folks that get in to use them and can help look at the data that comes with the specimens and the stories that come with the specimens, then I think the better appreciation we have of the natural world that we live in. And I've been fortunate enough to work in some amazing places where we can use museum collections to answer some pretty cool questions like, when did the Tristan moorhen go extinct? Or across how many snipe do you see these incredibly brilliant white patches? These are questions that, museum collections can really help to answer.
Are you a natural history biography reader?
I try not to mix work and pleasure so much.
Yeah, I wondered about that because there's so many great works now that are really biographies of significant figures in natural history. Many of them those people who went out either with shotguns or with pairs of secateurs collecting plant specimens, but working in really untrod or inhospitable places. Amazing stories to reflect how things were done with the colonial expansions of all of the empires and the races to become famous by procuring some kind of new specimen. But
oh yeah,
but is that easy to separate the work from the fun stories that are out there? Like you don't get sucked into sort of rabbit holes and wanting to keep learning more and more and more and more.
I mean,
when you're not on the clock.
I mean, that's the nature of museum work. The thing about museum work is you have to realize you'll never finish anything. There are, at the NHM, we've got 60,000 drawers of specimens. I could open and study one a day for the rest of my career and make it through maybe half of them. There's always more knowledge out there. There's the key is trying to link that knowledge and know that it exists with the people who need it. And so someone comes in and says, "Oh, I'm doing this, weird project about, birds in Central Asia." I'd be like, "Oh, right, cool. We can talk about slender-billed curlews, or we can talk about, things like that, sociable lapwing." And so and so studied curlews, and you might want to look at this, and so and so did lapwing stuff, and you might want to look at that. In a very similar way to a librarian, if you go in and say, "I need to know something about car engines," they might not know anything about car engines, but they know where to point you. And I think museum curators operate in a very similar realm. It's, there's 11,000 species of birds in the world. We can know an awful lot about them, but we'll never know everything. But we can point you to where you can find that information. And I think that's building that network. I think is of knowledge is probably one of the most rewarding bits.
Well, it sounds like your role as a curator at the Natural History Museum, or a curator, not the curator, is essentially a role where you are a facilitator to assist the work of many other people.
I mean, that's certainly a chunk of it. So we get about 200 scientific visitors. Well, 200 visitors to the collection a year. That includes scientists, artists, humanities researchers, historians, that sort of thing as well. So, and a big chunk of what we do is to help those folks make use of the collections in ways that benefit the research they're doing.
But it sounds like there's got to be a bit of creative tension between that role, but also the drive that you must have as a field researcher and as you're wanting to be like a scientist in the sort of commonly understood sense. Is that difficult to?
No, because it's one and the same thing. Do you ask a university prof, about the tensions they feel between their teaching about the subject and then researching the subject? It's quite similar. I might only have stumbled across the Tristan moorhen egg because I was helping somebody with an inquiry, or woodcock that was started as a research inquiry and built into a collaboration that resulted in a paper. So there's all sorts of these things that start simple or small with a simple query here and there that can turn into these really incredible things. And similarly, for my own research, we use the collections for for any number of things. So it's, you see it sort of as a resource rather than something that's in competition with.
So how much of your year is able to be spent like out in the field?
So because I'm curator in charge, I manage a team of 11 here at the NHM, and that includes the rest of the curatorial team and a couple of researchers. So I'm pretty lucky, and I'm able to get out to Australia once or twice a year, and usually once a year to Nunatsiavut in eastern Canada for field work. But part of that as well is that my days of spending 4 months on a seabird island are well and truly behind me.
Well, it's really gone.
So that it suits me absolutely just fine. The limiting step is finding the time once you're back to start writing it all up and analyzing it.
Do you socialize with bird nerds?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are the some of the same folks that that I've known for a really long time, or we'll go bird watching together, something like that. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it seems to be that you, the social circles sort of remain fairly tight. And I mean, have you got any hot rodding mates?
I'm sorry. Any?
Guys who are into rebuilding car engines and
Oh
getting
yeah.
it down to the track. Oh, good.
I mean,
good.
not quite down to the track, but yeah, a good mate of mine, and I go over to his whenever I need need to change something on my road bike. But yeah, he's absolutely into cars and bikes and all sorts of things.
Oh, I can't let that go. What's your road bike?
Oh, just like a push bike.
Oh, I thought you were going to tell me that you've got this massive Kawasaki or Suzuki.
No, he does. No, mine's just push bike, but yeah, for the road.
Okay. Oh, I nearly, I could picture you in your leathers and heading up to the highlands of Scotland on your.
Oh man, I mean, wouldn't say no.
Martin's getting us back on track.
Okay.
Martin's got a nest with egg
I'll have
specimens.
to leave in about 10 minutes as well. Sorry.
Yes, yeah, we've certainly gone over time. Martin's got a nest with egg specimens that is looking for a home in the freezer. Should he get it to a museum?
So it depends where Martin lives. If Martin is
Central Queensland.
Central Queensland. Oh, that's going to be a tough one. So two obvious places to speak with. One is the Australian Museum in Sydney, and one is the Queensland Museum in Brisbane. And they'll have contact forms where you can get in touch with the curatorial team. And every museum is different in terms of how they manage acquisitions. In the UK, we can basically pay to have the specimen sent to us if it's something that we want to acquire. Every institution will be a little bit different. So, but those would be the two that I would suggest you get in touch with and see what they say.
There we go. I hope that's answered that for you, Martin. Now, Alex, what was your gateway bird? What got you into birding?
My gateway bird. What was my gateway bird? It's my gateway bird. It's terrible to say. Was Atlantic puffin. They're terrible, boring, awful, 1 pound balls of hate. But they're just I mean, I love them to bits, but honestly, so overdone.
But balls of hate, is that because they despise their neighbours?
No, it's because when you've got them in the hand, they've got inward pointing claws on their innermost toe, which just have a habit of getting caught under your fingernails. And yeah, they're not, they're just cranky. But yeah, it was the auks in general, because they were like the true seabirds. They weren't like a gull that you saw down at the McDonald's parking lot or something like that, or a tern that you saw at a lake. They were like proper seabirds.
And you've really got to admire those chicks that can go to the edge of the cliff and just take that
And
leap.
just jump. Yeah, the Guillemot
Yeah,
chicks. No, that's
yeah,
fantastic. That's yeah. And there's so much we don't know about, how and why and what they do when they jump. And some people think they go off with the fathers. And there's been some really neat tagging work that's tried to look at that. And because they jump when they're only about 25% of adult mass.
yeah.
And how that the rest of that development finishes is just really, really fascinating.
Well, there's more than a few PhDs there to unlock those secrets.
Always.
Uh, you've worked so many places, Alex. Is there somewhere that you really would like to get to that you haven't been, and a bird or a location that you would like to study?
Oh gosh, yeah. I mean, I have been incredibly lucky in. Um, I always say I've fallen into the ocean in 4 of the 5 major oceanic basins. I've yet to fall into the Indian Ocean, but we're working on that. Um,
How,
I just landing on islands, or inevitably someone ends up in the drink once in a while. Um, I think in terms of places I'd love to visit. Yeah, I mean, of course, there's always amazing places that you'd want to go. I think for me, it comes down to what the impact I could potentially have for the birds in those places. If there's lots of folks working there already, it's not quite as appealing as going somewhere that's been a little bit neglected for a while.
do you get the same buzz if you're out in like deep forest jungles as you do with seabirds, islands, or perhaps those marshes, wetlands where seabirds will also or
Oh, look,
waders will hang
one
out?
one of my best bird moments ever was about a year ago, and I was in northern Victoria, Australia, in Alpine National Park, and we saw superb lyrebird. We saw 2 of them up in the hills, and that was just it was fantastic. It was a fantastic day with great people. A bird that we tried to go and see, 2 or 3 times before, and it always just missed out. And to see 2 of them on the same day was incredibly special. And then we came down, and just as we were walking to the car, this flock of 30 yellow-tailed black cockatoos flew over, and was like that.
They're
That
a
does
great
it for
bird.
me. They're fantastic.
They're a
That
great
does it
bird.
for me just as much as seeing a Henderson petrel, or a great shearwater, or being in a McGilvery's prawn colony. It's still in that same flavor.
And there's people in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne who have lyrebirds in their backyard, just
Yeah, well,
sitting
good
around.
for them. That's
Yeah,
fine.
it's
I'm
great,
not
isn't
jealous at all.
it? I know it's really cool. So, is there somewhere that's like on your bucket list where you really want to get to now?
I mean, there's places that I'd love to get to, and then there's places that are just are completely unrealistic to ever get to again. I think I've got enough on my plate at the moment for field work. Bucket list. I mean, I'd absolutely love to get to some of the islands off the northwest coast of the Pilbara in Australia. There's some fantastic birds out there. They've just been really neglected, I think, for a really long time. And I've been able to help out remotely with a couple of projects. So it'd be really great to get out to some of those places.
Who have you been helping out? So is that out on the Abrolhos or further north?
No, so this is another Adrift Lab study site up off of Port Hedland.
Okay, so very cool. Well, we'll be looking forward to hearing more about that. Um, what's your bucket list bird?
Oh well, I mean it was lyrebird until last year. These days I'm trying to think what it would be. Um, I don't think I've really got one, to be honest. I mean, we're so spoiled here in the collection that I want to go and see what this looks like. You can go and have a look. It's not the same, obviously, as seeing it in life, but we are a bit spoiled for choice.
So surely a slender-billed curlew would get you.
I mean, yeah, but they're
would get you racing off to the north of Africa.
Well, I mean,
I mean, do you do that? Do you do
No.
the you don't have the Twitcher disease?
No, absolutely not.
No.
Absolutely not.
No,
No.
we share that one.
So my bird would be Steller Seagull.
Okay.
So we had a couple when I worked in Alaska that were in the vicinity, but we never saw it. But I just think seeing a full adult with that huge, amazing bill would just be amazing.
Yeah, terrifying if you got up close.
Yeah, exactly.
I would think.
Yeah.
So, last question for you, Alex.
Yep.
What's the best bird?
Oh, they're all good birds, Grant.
Correct answer. Correct answer.
But if gun to my head, for me, it's got to be razorbill. They're black and white, svelte, yellow inside of the mouth, make a fantastic grunty noise. Underappreciated. Yeah, love them to bits.
They're all of those, cliff nesting, North Atlantic seabirds are underappreciated and not well enough known. But to be able to breed in those environments is just astounding to me.
I mean, we know more about guillemots than I think any other species of North Atlantic seabird because they've just been studied so intensively for so long at a few key places. Puffins are sort of the same, but razorbills have been the one that's sort of, just fallen through the cracks, metaphorically and sometimes physically, on some of those nesting cliffs. So yeah, they're wonderful.
I lied. There's always another question after an answer like that. What's the conservation status for the razorbill?
So I think globally they're near threatened. So they've got some population declines, but I think that's just not the reasons behind it are not very well known. I think they certainly face some hunting pressure in some areas, and climate change affecting distribution of some of the forage fish species that they go after. But yeah, not really a huge focus compared with some of the other species, certainly not in the UK.
Well, folks, I hope you've enjoyed meeting Dr. Alex Bond, author of some amazing papers, such as Historic Evidence of the Use of Storm Petrels as Candles, and many other great works, some of which we've been discussing today. I mean, look, you have to have a look at the Google Scholar list for Alex. Not very often I get a good chuckle out of the title of many of the papers that I'm strolling through. But
there you go.
There's some rippers here, Alex. A great body of work, and I've only been looking at 2023 and 2022. I did go back to some of the really early ones. So you weren't quite as expansive with some of your titles back then.
Well, I've been working on it.
Obviously, and you've done a great job. Thanks a lot for joining us on the Bird Emergency. I hope we get the opportunity to catch up again sometime. It's such a big subject that we really did skip over plastic pollution, but there's probably a reason at some time to delve into it again. Maybe maybe after you've been to Lord Howe again, which I guess you're doing again soon.
In April of next year is our next trip out.
Ah, fantastic. Well, I look forward to following that work.
Yeah.
Folks, if you want to enjoy the Bird Emergency live, the easy way to do that is to go to thebirdemergency.com/Facebook or thebirdemergency.com/YouTube. Otherwise, just wait for it to hit the pod feed, and you can find that thebirdemergency.com/podcast. Alex, thanks so much for joining me. Been a delight. We've learned a lot.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Grant. Take care.
Cheers. See you, everyone.